Libertarianism is pro-immigration, pro-market, pro-trade.
More competitive, less centralized.
Not military confrontations, but peaceful interaction.
The war on drugs has been actually an unmitigated disaster.
And intellectuals came to the scene saying that, hey, listen, we Muslims have a problem. We are sticking to classical interpretations of the law without reimagining them, without reinterpreting them. But the world has changed. There are great things out there we should, actually understand. And some of the things we have is really problematic. So let's change. This whole reformist thing began in late 19th century, and it had some successes. It led to legal reforms in the Ottoman Empire. In the middle of the 19th century, the ban on apostasy was abolished by the Ottomans. They didn't touch the legal Islamic code, but they brought secular laws which rendered them obsolete. They made Christians and Jews equal citizens of the empire. Women gained almost equal rights with the Ottoman Civil Code in 1917. So a lot of reforms took place, and that was because of this new idea. And that process is going on. But there are other people who think that this is deviation. This is like this is kind of Vestoxification and so on and so forth and go on. And this Islamic world is in the middle of this battle, this war of ideas. And I think it would be wrong to assume that the most fanatic or rigid elements in this war of ideas define Islam as what it is. It's a spectrum. Now, what are the reformists arguing? And I'm trying to be one of them with what I've been writing and saying. Well, there are a few arguments, and I just want to summarize them quickly. One is to go back to the Quran. What does this mean? It means this. In Islam, there are roots of jurisprudence. First the Quran, the Word of God, then the Sunnah or tradition of the Prophet Muhammad. But there's a problem there because the whole books about Prophet Muhammad were written 2 centuries after his death. So it's a very disputed tradition there. Then, the way that these were interpreted by medieval scholars, their consensus and their analogies, you have hundreds and hundreds of books of legal jurisprudence there. But the Quran is one book. And it is only the Quran that is undisputed. The rest is human interpretation. Even if you say this is a prophet saying, it's a human interpretation because it was collected 2 centuries after the prophet's death by scholars who said this is the right, saying and so on and so forth. So the reformists are saying, let's go back to the Quran and criticize, at least question, the legal tradition that we have at our hand. And when you do that, you see very interesting things. The Quran has nothing to say about punishing apostates. The Quran has nothing to say about punishing blasphemers. These do not exist in the Quran. It says post-Quranic. The Quran says something about women dress code, but it doesn't say they should be covered from head to toe with no eyes and that kind of burqa. It's not there. Basically, the injunctions of the Quran were interpreted by medieval scholars from their time, from their culture, from their context, and that became the law. And the reformists are saying, let's rethink these things. On the issue of apostasy that I touched upon, I'll give you one example. Why medieval Islamic scholars, in all seriousness, thought that apostates should be punished by death, and what was their logic? It's not in the Quran, but it's in. They refer to some wars in early Islam, and they made this inference from the acts of the first caliph Abu Bakr, and there are some sayings attributed to Prophet Muhammad, which I would dispute. But there's one more thing. Those scholars of Islam were living in a context. They were living in a certain historical moment. And in that moment, an apostate from Islam was, by definition, somebody who deserted from the Muslim side and joined the enemy. It was a time Muslims were fighting with the Sassanid Empire and the Byzantine Empire and so on and so forth. So an apostate meant somebody who just leaves your side and joins the other side. For them, it was high treason. So there was a context to it. And the reformists are saying, let's look into this context. We can understand that particular injunction maybe made sense in that context, but we live in a different world today. When you change your religion, you're not becoming a Russian spy against America or something, or I don't know, the other. It's your conscience. So we have to reform these things. So there are scholars who make these arguments. and I fully agree with them, and that's contextualization of Sharia. So I think, therefore, we need reform in the Muslim world, but I should qualify that. It has nothing to do with the Protestant Reformation. The Protestant Reformation was against a Catholic mainstream authority. In Islam, we don't have a mainstream authority. It's just all diverse. It's about reinterpreting the law. And since there's no papacy, there won't be a one Muslim pope and who will come and say, now we reformed Islam and we love the atheists and the California Buddhists and everybody is. I mean, it's not going to happen next day. It's going to happen through changing minds, changing attitudes. It's going to happen through a long process, as it happened in Protestant Christianity too. Like it took a few centuries in Europe to come from religious wars to more liberal attitudes in religion. So this will go on. One more thing, I believe that we need to look into issues of jurisprudence in Islam. We should discuss them honestly. Also, we should reopen some theological debates in early Islam. And we should even rediscover some lost theological schools in early Islam. So what do I mean by this? I'll give you just one example. And I'm working on a book on this, so I would encourage you to buy it when it comes out. Here is a particular school in early Islam I find very interesting and fascinating. Islam from the beginning was cursed by political power. There was already states, the Sultan, the Caliph, and the Caliph was a Sultan of Sur. And who gets power created a lot of drama, a lot of tension. We have civil wars in early Islam, not on the nature of Christ, as Christians would dispute. It's about who is the Caliph, right? Who will get power. So this power dynamic created civil wars. It's called fitna, first fitna, second fitna, all wars. And in the midst of these civil wars, a fanatic group emerged. They're known as Khawarij in Arabic, or Kharijites in English, which is translated dissenters. And they look at the two sides of the war, and there was supporters of Ali, which would evolve into Shiites, and supporters of Muawiyah, which I wouldn't be, at least some proto-Sunnis were there, let's say. And they said, these Khawarij, these fanatics, they said, both sides are unbelievers. Both sides are heretics. And since apostates should be killed, they started killing other fellow Muslims. So these were the Al-Qaeda of the first century, as one of my friends once called. I mean, they were the ultimate fanatics. And their idea was that this person is a heretic, an apostate, and you can kill him. So the logic goes there. So they were punishing people in the name of God, right? So this is a terrible thing. And some people today think that ISIS Al-Qaeda represents a resurgence of that Khawarij mindset. But luckily, there was an antidote to this terrible theology. This theology was offered by more urban, educated scholars in Iraq and Syria. And they said, wait, you cannot judge people in the name of God. Only God can judge people. And when God will do this? In afterlife, after we die. There's a verse in the Quran which says God will judge among you on the things that you differed when you go to God, when you go to afterlife. So they said, we will learn who's right and wrong and who's the real heretic only when we die. So let's postpone this decision on who is the right Muslims or not to afterlife. That's why they were called the postponers, Murjia in Arabic. And they created the perfect theology for toleration. I think you're wrong, but I can't judge you. I'll postpone it to afterlife. So God, let God sort it out. What can I do? I can just live with you. So the Murjia created a basis of toleration among early Muslims, and that's why ISIS in its monthly magazine, they had a monthly magazine, and I was reading it, all the time. Not because I liked it, but to see what they're saying. There was a very long article in one of the issues of Dominick, their monthly magazine. Murjia, the greatest heresy in the Ummah. Like the greatest heresy in the history of Islam for them, that was the Murjia. Because why? The Murjia would be rendering them powerless, right? Murjia is saying you can't do this. So they knew what they were talking about, so they knew Murjia was a very bad idea for them. And one more thing, when I read a letter concerning toleration by John Locke, I said, oh, he's saying the same thing. John Locke, in a passage says there are different churches in England at the time. He says, let the Almighty decide which church has the ultimate right doctrine, and in the meantime on earth, let these churches coexist. And he was trying to create an idea of coexistence, saying that God is the judger, and we are. And I said, wow, we have John Locke there, and we have Murjia, and we have the other sides too. And in Christianity, there were some other guys too. So I think in all religious traditions, you have sources of toleration, sources of freedom. The Quran has a famous, very much emphasized verse, La ikraha fi din, which means there is no compulsion in religion. So that's the motto of the liberal-minded Muslims, let's say. But then there are interpretations of the Quran that abrogated that verse and said, no, it's not relevant anymore. So these interpretations within Islam exist, and I think Muslims are struggling with these issues. And I think the struggle will go on in the years and decades ahead. I'll stop, but before that, one more thing. We're discussing this issue not in Istanbul or Cairo or Afghanistan, or we're discussing this in Florida. So people can ask, okay, this is very interesting, what Westerners can do, what can we do, how can we help this? And my answer is generally, well, you cannot directly do too much, because this is an intra-Islamic affair. I mean, Muslims will not change their mind because somebody in Washington or Brussels say, this is the right course of Islam, that should take place. However, Westerners can be helpful or unhelpful. They can be unhelpful if they decide to liberate Muslim countries by occupying or bombing them. That doesn't help. We had that in the past 150 years. I'll tell you, it doesn't help. It makes our job very difficult, because it's very difficult to argue about liberal ideas when you are being attacked, or you're being attacked, real or perceived, sometimes real. Actually, that confrontation between West and the Muslim world only empowers the fanatics and the radicals. When you look at the whole history of 150 years, you see the bursts of Islamism. It comes after a colonial era. Or, the US occupation of Iraq gave us ISIS, right? Because that perception of threats makes people more aggressive, more defensive. It doesn't help. But something else helps, and that is not military confrontations, but peaceful interactions between Muslims and Western societies. It helps that Muslims from their part of the world come to US and see what a free society is, right? Wow, here you can be anything and you can be a pious Muslim, and that's great. And they have an idea and they go back with that education. It helps to have cultural dialogues. It helps to have student exchanges. It helps to have diplomatic relations and trade, and peaceful interactions are generally helpful. It helped me when I misunderstood a pancake, then I learned a lot. So I think that is the way to go. I'm in favor of not building walls between Muslims and Western societies at a time when building walls are a little popular. I'm in favor of peaceful interactions and helping the Muslim world, sort out this great struggle through channels of dialogue. And that's why I'm very happy to have this dialogue today, and that's why I'm very thankful to Florida Gulf State University to bring me here. And thanks for being here again. Thanks.